Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video number 86 in audio season 4, episode 27 of Music is Not a Genre. Thank you as always for watching and listening. Don't forget you can support this podcast at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre or anchor.fm/musicisnotagenre. Or you can go to my public hub, which is youtube.com/Nick DiMatteo. And stay tuned. My website, as I mentioned last week, I'll be giving you sneak peeks of my brand new podcast hub on my website, nickdimatteo.com. If you go to nickdimatteo.com/podcast, you can see a preview of it. It's in the works, but there's a lot there already. Absorb it. Hope you enjoy it. Let's get to this week's topic, supergroups. How super are they? Audioslave, Velvet Revolver, and the rest. I had a lot of fun with this one this week. I mean, I have fun with all of them every week, right? That's the job. But this week in particular, what was interesting was I try to vary the kinds of podcasts I do. So, I do Death is Dumb, I do books, I do, interviews and various other sub-series and things like that. And then I try to get back to kind of the nitty-gritty, the basics of this, which is just let's talk about an album or a band or what have you. And so I made a list of a few and decided whichever one kind of gripped me the most, that's the one I would go with. And it turned out to be this one. I started doing a little bit of research on supergroups and realized I have very strong opinions about that. And you're going to hear all of them. And I have some information of, general kind of supergroup stuff too, but it all came out of, it was all inspired by, primarily, you see if you're watching and not listening, for those of you listening, I can describe, there are 4 CDs in front of me, 1 from Audioslave, 2 from Velvet Revolver, and then a 4th one from a band called Tinted Windows, which I'll get into a little bit later. There's a reason why I included them here, but it really was inspired by the first 2 bands there, Audioslave and Velvet Revolver, because I had done Death is Dumb episodes on Soundgarden for Chris Cornell and Stone Temple Pilots for Scott Weiland. And even though I mentioned these bands, because if I'm going to be focusing on the lead singers, I should talk about their entire career, I had made kind of a footnote, a little earmark there, and said, I'm not going to get deeply into these bands because there's something different about them, and they weren't kind of the core bands for them, and still wasn't sure exactly what to do with them until I started doing this supergroup research. So what I found, and you probably know this part, is that in general, the definition of a supergroup is a group made up of members from other groups that have released things, that have performed live and released things. It's not just, your friend was in a band in the basement and then he joined a different band in a different basement, So there's at least that kind of very slight criteria. The thing is that doesn't satisfy me. That didn't work for me because by that definition, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of supergroups out there, and I don't think that's true. So I decided to take it 2 steps further. Step 1, and you can read a lot of this in the text below. I don't often refer to the text this much, but I want to this time. Step 1, we can have lots of fun. The groups or solo careers these people came from needed to have been famous on their own. So the origin groups or origin careers, they had to have been known somehow. Step 2, the new group has to have had some measure of success. So in short, the definition that I give for supergroup is a famous new group formed by members of famous old groups, which includes also solo careers. So that means that there are a bunch of categories that no longer apply. That according to the interwebs and, Wikipedia and some other places that I looked, there are lists and lists of supergroups, and so many of them I hadn't heard of. And yes, okay, a caveat there, which is if you're not into a certain type of music, there's a chance that you haven't heard of certain bands in that type of music, in that, loose genre group. And so I can't be the final judge of that, because as much as I might know, I don't know nearly everything. And so there might have been bands on these lists that I dismissed too quickly because I didn't know. But on the whole, if there was something I hadn't heard of, I did a little research anyway to determine whether or not they kind of qualified. And so these are the disqualifications from these groups. So first of all, groups in supergroups whose members were in groups no one has heard of. And I found a couple of these on websites and on the lists. The one of which was a little timely because I just recently did an audition for the Jersey Boys, and that's all about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And so that band has been in my head for the last month or so. Somehow I ended up on this supergroup list. Now, when I had done the audition, I took a dive and learned more about them and discovered that their career was a lot longer than I realized, which is often true for bands and solo artists, and that they had been in other groups before. But here's the thing. Can any of you name any of the other groups that any member of Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons were in before they formed Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons? Time's up. Me neither. I can't even remember what I read. I read a list, and I read it twice, actually, Santa, and I have no memory of what those were. So to me, again, if you haven't heard of the person or the group prior to them forming this new group, then that doesn't count to me. That's not a supergroup. Another disqualification, new groups almost no one has heard of or remembers. And of course almost, because there's someone out there who's heard every group someone's heard of somewhere. And here's an example. If you know a fair amount about music, you've probably heard of at least two out of these three bands: Filter, Nine Inch Nails, Stone Temple Pilots. Fairly good careers, all of them, some bigger than others. But does anyone, pun intended, remember Army of Anyone? And I will say this, when I was doing my Stone Temple Pilots chronology, I went through all of Scott Weiland's solo career, and I went through the DeLeo brothers' offshoots and things like that, of which Army of Anyone is one of those, I believe. And good music, fun, great, but if most people haven't heard of them or don't remember them, then to me that's really shaky ground as far as calling them a supergroup. Another disqualification, glorified solo projects is what I call them. So people mostly from one band with some side people from other lesser known bands. A good example, late 80s, there was a group, GTR, that had a couple of minor hits. They were from other kind of progressive rock and metal bands, but okay, right? But most of that was from one band. A Perfect Circle, which is, I believe, I want to say that's from the members of Tool. And again, I'm not sure where anybody else came from. That's one reason why I disqualify them. And then Zwan, which was Billy Corgan's offshoot band from Smashing Pumpkins. Doesn't quite work. Not sure why they were on this list. Another disqualification, established bands that had another famous person join in for a while. So many examples of these. And no, they're not supergroups. And let me make a statement here by saying I'm not passing judgment on any of the music of any of these. The music, everyone has their tastes, and every band and artist has their fans, and this music is minimum good, if not great, in many cases. So it's not about the music, it's just about, honestly, the definition of what a supergroup is. And so an example of these established bands that had somebody join in, Red Hot Chili Peppers have had many more than one lead guitarist, and one of those was Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction. Okay, And I actually loved the album that he did with them. It's one of my favorite Red Hot Chili Peppers albums, but that doesn't make that a supergroup. When coincidentally John Frusciante, who is back with Chili Peppers, joined in with Mars Volta, who had members from At the Drive-In, it doesn't make them a supergroup. Sorry, that makes them Mars Volta with John Frusciante sitting in as a guitarist. This one almost made me jump out of my seat when I read it, as far as defining what a supergroup is. When Paul Rodgers from Bad Company and Free, and I'm going to mention him again, or those bands again later, became for a while the lead singer of Queen. That doesn't make it a supergroup. I'm sure it was awesome in many ways. Paul Rodgers has an amazing voice, and Queen's a great band. Brian May is a great guy, but that doesn't, no, that was, again, somebody sitting in for a while. Doesn't make him a supergroup. Another one, glorified solo projects. One famous musician forming a band with a bunch of non-famous people, like Wings, is a good example. I'm sure there are a ton of other examples. I put this on here just to make sure we're clear. Though bands like that have not tended to show up on supergroup lists, but if you're someone who knows so much more about lesser known musicians than I do even, and you knew that, like, I don't know, Denny Lane came from some other band, or I can't even remember the other members of Wings, then you might think, oh, that's a supergroup. I don't think that qualifies. And then finally, personal favorites. And this is the kind of one where everybody's list is different, so stuff can be swapped out very easily. But what I define this as a new group of famous musicians that you wish everyone else knew, but they never quite got there. And a great example for me is one that I saw on a list of supergroups that I initially included in my list that qualified, but I had to be honest about it and realize it was wishful thinking, and it's a band called Tinted Windows. No, you haven't heard of them. Yes, that's right. And if you have, awesome. That's great. Talk to me about it in the comments. Tinted Windows put out a single album in 2009. They were formed by 4 quite famous people: Adam Schlesinger of Fountains of Wayne, Taylor Hanson of Hanson, James Iha of Smashing Pumpkins, and Bun E. Carlos from Cheap Trick. 4 very famous bands in their own ways came together to make some pretty cool power pop. Didn't go anywhere. So as much as I'd like to include them on a supergroup list, that's shady to me. It's shaky ground yet again. Now that we have established this very, strict classification of what makes a supergroup or not, I'm going to read you a truncated list, and my list of as many as I could find. I'm sure it's not comprehensive, but it's pretty darn close, of who I consider to be supergroups. So 1968, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Those people, a great band, came from the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, and the Hollies. 1969, Blind Faith, who was successful. I couldn't honestly name a song. Maybe I could if I heard it. The Yardbirds, Cream, Traffic, and the Spencer Davis Group. I mean, the last two was the same guy, but still famous bands. 1973, Bad Company, Paul Rodgers, came from Free, Mott the Hoople, and King Crimson, all of whom had successful careers. You skip all the way to 1982 and you have Asia, which I'll be reviewing a book maybe before the end of this season that a friend of mine wrote on the career of Asia. Very comprehensive. Though that was deliberately formed as a supergroup, and those people came from King Crimson, Uriah Heep, Yes, the Buggles, Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, all fairly well known in their own ways. 1984, The Power Station, which I actually liked the big. I think they did the cover of Bang a Gong, Get It On, or whatever, which I really liked, even better than the original. They came from Chic, Duran Duran, and then Robert Palmer's solo career, very successful solo career before then. 1988, Traveling Wilburys, the Beatles, ELO, and then you had Bob Dylan and Tom Petty and Roy Orbison, who were every single one of those people in that band. I mean, Jeff Lynne being the slightly weaker link, but still qualifies, was just super well known and super successful. And I'm going to go on record as saying that the Traveling Wilburys were the superest supergroup ever. Dispute me, please. Or agree with me. 1989 was the first time that Ringo Starr formed an all-star band. And every year or so, a couple of years, he will swap out musicians. But he has criteria, which is each member of the band has to have had 2 hits on their own or from their other band. So he's sort of laying the groundwork here, saying like we are an all-star band. Another way of saying a supergroup. You have to have some kind of enough of a past and a history to qualify. Makes sense to me. 1990, Temple of the Dog. Members of Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Mother Love Bone, and Green River. I put them on there, but I'm still not sure, and it's tricky, and I'll tell you why. When their songs were released, not much happened. Then those bands, well, the first two bands, Soundgarden and Pearl Jam in particular, became very famous, and the songs were re-released. I'm Going Hungry, or Hunger Strike, that's called, became a big hit. So the timing is weird on that. The timeline is such that these were members coming together to pay tribute to a guy who had died, and did an album which was kick-ass, but at the time they weren't exactly famous. Then they became famous, some of them. Then Temple of the Dog, retroactively became famous. It's a little bit of a twist and turn here. I'm going to keep them on the list, but that's a tricky one. 1994, Foo Fighters. You want to say, no, they're just Foo Fighters, and it's Dave Grohl's next band from Nirvana. But if you realize that Pat Smear, who was also in Nirvana in latter years, was from the band The Germs, seminal punk band, and then you had members of Sunny Day Real Estate, a proto-emo band that hates being called emo, then they are supergroup. By every definition, they are a supergroup, and I liken them, Foo Fighters, to Bad Company, and I'll explain why after this list. And then, of course, boom, 2001, Audioslave, coming from Soundgarden and Rage Against the Machine. The following year, Velvet Revolver, Stone Temple Pilots, Guns N' Roses, absolutely supergroups. 2004, a band called Mad Villain, made by MF Doom and Madlib, who had very successful solo careers. Their album Mad Villainy, which has been on a lot of best ever lists, is often considered their best work in any group that they were in or solo. 2006, Danger Doom. This is sort of a footnote to the one before because it also includes MF Doom, but it also includes Danger Mouse, and he'll pop up again a little later on this list. I put them on there as a footnote, not necessarily because they qualify, because who the hell remembers Danger Doom? 2009, them Crooked Vultures. If you are into that kind of power rock, then you know this band and you probably enjoy what they put out. Members of Nirvana, Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl, of course, Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones, and Queens of the Stone Age, Josh Homme. So that's a super group. 2010, Broken Bells. I once had a CD by them. I gave it up because it didn't really captivate me. But that is also Danger Doom. I'm sorry, Danger Mouse. I put Danger Doom. Now I have to correct this. Danger Mouse and James Mercer of the Shins and Gnarls Barkley. So you have, pedigree there. They did actually have some songs that, were minor hits, so they're on this list. 2013, Run the Jewels. I think they've done, 3 albums since then? And the album they put out last year, is it 4? LP and Killer Mike, who had successful solo careers before they formed Run the Jewels. Run the Jewels is just acclaimed all the way up and down, and their last album just blew me away. 2015, Hollywood Vampires. I put this band on here because it is a band that was formed to raise money for charity, but also because it consists of Alice Cooper, Joe Perry, and Johnny Depp, and then like a couple dozen guest artists over the years. They're primarily a live band. I'm not even sure they've recorded anything. I don't honestly know much about them other than that they exist and these are the people in them. But that's a supergroup, you know, because they have a name. People have heard of them. 2019, the Highwomen, Brandi Carlile, Amanda Shires, Maren Morris, and Natalie Hemby. I know some of Brandi Carlile's work. I have heard of some of the stuff that other people have done, but I don't know a lot about country music. But clearly this is a supergroup, very clearly. They got a lot of press when they got together, and they all had successful careers before then. And then 2021, baby, Silk Sonic. You know, started out as a bit of a joke with Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak, just, you know, with that type of kind of retro, you're not sure if they're joking or not, they knocked it out of the park in many ways. And yeah, then they had hits, and they certainly had them before. So yeah, that's a supergroup. And like I said, I know I've missed some, you know. Now here's a question that everyone, I think, asks at some point when you're talking about a supergroup, which is the new music better than the old music? You know, is the supergroup music better than the origin bands or solo career music? And I'm going to throw these down. In a few cases, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Bad Company, Foo Fighters, Mad Villain, Run the Jewels. I'm going to go on record as saying yes, that the music that all of them created, on the whole, is better even than where they came from. And let me state, where all of them came from was already pretty awesome. So it's not that I'm saying, oh, that was subpar and then they came together and it was magic. I'm just saying it was even better than that. Because you can't, you know, when you're talking about, I mean, the Hollies, such an awesome band, and Buffalo Springfield and the Byrds, you know, and certainly Nirvana and the Germs and Sunny Day Real Estate and Free and Mott the Hoople and King Crimson. Like, these are all the bands and all, you know, the solo careers of the people in Mad Villain and Run the Jewels. All amazing music already, but they came together and made even better music. Their music can stand alone, even if their origin, you know, careers didn't exist, which I think is what truly makes a supergroup super. They're supergroups, but then they're supergroups. These are the supergroups. And I will include Traveling Wilburys on that, not because their music was markedly better than where they came, because how could you top pretty much any of the stuff that they did before then, but because, again, member-wise, and then their success before and during, you know, I don't think can be matched in a lot of ways. But the answer to this question is the supergroup music usually better than the previous music? Pretty much almost always no, other than those exceptions. And I would say no. I would say even in the case of Traveling Wilburys, I love that music. I don't know that it's better than the Beatles or Dylan or you know, on and on and on. Them Crooked Vultures music is great, but it's not better than, you know, Foo Fighters and Nirvana and Queens of the Stone Age. And Broken Bells certainly not better for Danger Mouse or the Shins. I used to really, really love the Shins, or Hollywood Vampires. And to get to this week's, you know, inspirations here, definitely not Audioslave or Velvet Revolver. I have listened to every single album from Audioslave and Velvet Revolver, and the careers of the people involved in their origin bands, every album of those. And I can say for sure two things. They were great bands who created some damn good, if not in many cases, great music. But they were not better than Soundgarden and Stone Temple Pilots. And I want somebody who's a huge fan of these bands to tell me to go to hell and why you think they were better, you know. And I mean, if you were somebody who was let's say a Rage Against the Machine fan, because I'm coming at it from the Soundgarden side, and you were like, oh my God, the power Chris Cornell added just took them to another level. And I think on their middle album in particular, Out of Exile, and I think their last album, I think that's the case. Although I only have their first album, and that song, well, I'll talk about that later, then I understand that. Or if you were I think the Velvet Revolver's hard, because a lot of people, they were sort of not a joke, but a lot of people joked about them when they came out, because, you know, at the time, this was still during that extremely long period where they were like, is Guns N' Roses ever going to get back together, you know? And to have somebody like Weiland, whose voice I absolutely love, front essentially a band who used to have Axl Rose as the lead singer, was a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. And yet, I have both Velvet Revolver albums because I loved what they did. But again, they did not eclipse their, you know, Rage Against the Machine, Soundgarden, Stone Temple Pilots, Guns N' Roses. They didn't eclipse those bands. You know, at the same time, songs like, you know, Cochise and Show Me How to Live from Audioslave and The Last Fight and Fall to Pieces from Velvet Revolver are excellent songs. And those are just a few. Those are the ones that I remember and that I think I like the best. But there are so many more that I've absolutely enjoyed. You know, quick rundown while I'm here. Audioslave released 3 albums. Their eponymous album with those songs I mentioned before, as well as Like a Stone. Show Me How to Live is awesome because it sounds very introspective, and I think subtextually it is, but it was really written about Frankenstein's monster. And I learned that when I went through the chronology, and plus it just kicks ass. 2005, Out of Exile, where they kind of defined their sound more apart from their origin bands. And 2006, Revelations, which was fraught because they were pretty much in the process of breaking up, you know, prior to Soundgarden reforming, etc., etc. Velvet Revolver released 2 albums, Contraband in 2004, Boom right here with the song Fall to Pieces, my favorite from that, and 2007's Libertad. The Last Fight, I think, is a song that can stand up with, you know, in its own way with any Stone Temple Pilots song, even though I still prefer Stone Temple Pilots. And the other thing those bands share is that they ultimately had Brendan O'Brien step in as their producer, and he is one of my all-time favorite producers of any kind of music, and was seminal to 1990s rock. But it was always funny to me, especially back then, but even now, when I listen to something and say, oh man, I really like that, and read into it more and find out that Brendan O'Brien was the producer. Just awesome at what he does. And like I said, it's awesome that all these bands existed, you know, and they all have their fans. And I think the fact that there are some fans who like these supergroups better than the origin bands is actually kind of awesome too. And let's keep in mind too that in some cases, these supergroups were formed years after the members started their careers. And so let's just say, for example, that you were in your teens or 20s and, you know, Soundgarden or Rage, you know, was a band you were into. And then Audioslave comes. You might be like, okay, what are they doing? But let's say you're in your teens and 20s and Audioslave is, in a sense, the first time you heard those musicians. Then that might be why you're a bigger fan of that band than of their origin bands. And hopefully it got you to listen to the other music too. But that's, you know, timing is everything. I love that. And I love that there's that diversity of taste and that, you know, everybody has fans, including Rec. As you know, at the end of every podcast, they, you know, go over some of my music. I was in several bands before Rec, and I'm sure you've heard of all of them. Ape Cafe, the E-Bus. Man, I honestly forget a lot of the others. And, you know, members of Rec were in other bands, such as the Invisible Kid, et al. And the thing is, what's the truth there, right? none of those bands were famous yet, and Rec does not, qualify as being a hit maker yet. So no, I'm not putting Rec on this list. I have to be, if I'm going to be strict, I've got to be strict all the way up and down. I can't make an exception. Not to mention, there's actually no criteria under which Rec will be considered a supergroup. That said, I'm going to share a song at the end of this podcast and the link that I think shows that, I was listening to Audioslave and Velvet Revolver in particular, and the bands that came before them, and absorbed that and wanted to create something that, as I always say, is an amalgam, And it's the opening track on Rec's album Parts and Labor called I'm Gone. And I think you will hear the kind of kinship between, I'm Gone and Audioslave and Velvet Revolver. There's a hard-hittingness to it, especially when it comes to the guitars and the drums. But even the certain way that I sing, I would say it's more leaning towards Weiland, because I don't think in any world where I will be a Chris Cornell, and that's fine, even though I did cover Fell on Black Days for an acoustic show. I think I've said this before, that Weiland's voice and mine are much more similar, because they're malleable in certain ways and we have a very similar range. And you may or may not hear that in the song I'm Gone. And thanks for sticking around and listening to it. Do you remember these bands, Audioslave and Velvet Revolver? Do you remember Tinted Windows? Do you remember any of the bands on the list? Are there bands that I missed that should be on this list? You're like, how could I not put them on this stricter, version of a supergroup list? Tell me, because I'll add them to the list for posterity, sure. Or did I misjudge, certain bands in either direction? Do you think that I was too harsh on Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons? Do you think that there are bands that are on my list, such as, I don't know, let's say Them Crooked Vultures, where you're like, no, you're really stretching it there, buddy. I want to know your opinion of any single band or this entire idea of supergroups, because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for listening and watching, and I will talk to you next week.